The sound of drums echoed through a cold January morning in 1649. The wooden scaffold rose stark against the gray sky outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. A crowd had gathered, hushed and anxious, their breaths clouding in the winter air. Soldiers lined the square, their halberds fixed, their eyes scanning the restless mass of Londoners who had come to witness something unimaginable. A man, dignified yet solemn, stepped forward onto the platform. He was no ordinary prisoner. He was the King of England, Charles Stuart, the first monarch in English history to be brought to trial by his own people and condemned to die. A heavy silence fell as Charles knelt, his final words drowned out by the beat of the drum. In one swift stroke, the age of divine right was shattered. The crowd gasped, then erupted in a mixture of disbelief, fear, and awe. Someone shouted, "God save the King! No more!" And the cry echoed through the square as soldiers quickly raised their banners of Parliament. At that moment, England had crossed a threshold from which there could be no turning back. In January 1649, the unthinkable had happened. A King of England was executed by his own people. What followed was a bold experiment, an attempt to build a nation without monarchy, guided instead by the rule of Parliament and the vision of men who believed they served both God and England. At the heart of this story stood Oliver Cromwell, a man of faith, a soldier of iron, destined to change a kingdom forever. To understand how England reached such a moment, one must look back to the early years of the 17th century. The death of Elizabeth I in 1603 ended the Tudor age and ushered in the reign of the Stuart dynasty. James VI of Scotland became James I of England, uniting the crowns of two kingdoms under one head. But the promise of unity quickly gave way to division. The Stuarts believed firmly in the principle of divine right, the idea that kings ruled not by consent of the people, but by the will of God. James I, and later his son Charles I, viewed Parliament as a body to grant money when needed, not as a partner in governance. Parliament, emboldened by centuries of precedent and the growing confidence of England's political class, began to resist. They demanded accountability, limits on royal authority, and above all, a voice in how the kingdom was governed. England in the 17th century was also a battleground of faith. The official Church of England maintained a middle path between Catholic tradition and Protestant reform, yet this satisfied few. For the Puritans or English Calvinists, the Anglican Church remained tainted with the rituals and hierarchies of Rome. They demanded further reform, simpler worship, stricter morality, and a church governed by ministers rather than bishops appointed by the crown. On the other side, English Catholics lived under suspicion and recurring persecution, seen as potential traitors loyal to the Pope and to Spain. Charles I deepened these divisions. Influenced by his Catholic queen, Henrietta Maria of France, and by Archbishop William Laud, the king pushed for greater uniformity of worship. To Puritans, this was nothing less than tyranny over the conscience, and a dangerous slide back toward Catholicism. Religion was not a private matter. It shaped politics, identity, and loyalty. When Charles raised taxes without parliament, imprisoned opponents without trial, and tried to enforce his religious policies across the realm, resistance hardened into rebellion. The storm in England did not unfold in isolation. Across the Channel, the 30 Years' War was ravaging Central Europe, a conflict fueled by dynastic ambition and religious struggle. Protestant and Catholic powers clashed, reshaping the map of Europe. England, though not a major player, felt its impact through strained finances, failed military expeditions, and the constant fear that Catholic Spain or France might threaten her shores. Charles I's costly wars drained the treasury. When Parliament refused to grant the funds he demanded, he resorted to forced loans and other extra-legal measures. The more he grasped at authority, the more he provoked resistance. By the 1640s, the realm was fractured. England, Scotland, and Ireland each seethed with discontent. The king's rule without parliament, known as the personal rule, ended only when he was forced to summon it again, desperate for money to suppress rebellion in Scotland. The clash between monarch and parliament was no longer a matter of debate. It would be decided on the battlefield. Amid this turmoil emerged Oliver Cromwell, a man whose life seemed at first unremarkable. Born in 1599 in the modest town of Huntingdon, Cromwell came from the gentry class, wealthy enough to own land, but far from the great nobles of the realm. His early years were marked by uncertainty. He studied at Cambridge, returned to manage his family's estate, and for a time faded into obscurity. Illness and personal crisis drove him deeper into a fervent Puritan faith. It was this faith that shaped Cromwell's destiny. He believed England was engaged in a struggle between God's chosen and the forces of corruption. When the Civil War broke out in 1642, Cromwell took up arms not as a career soldier, but as a man convinced of divine mission. At first, his role seemed minor, captain of a small troop of cavalry, yet his energy, discipline, and sheer conviction quickly set him apart. Unlike many commanders drawn from aristocratic privilege, Cromwell inspired his men with both moral zeal and practical effectiveness. He trained his soldiers, the Ironsides, to fight with order, restraint, and unyielding determination. In Cromwell's view, victory would come not through wealth or lineage, but through godliness and resolve. As the war dragged on, Cromwell rose from obscurity to prominence. His cavalry distinguished themselves at battles like Marston Moor in 1644, where their charge helped secure a decisive parliamentarian victory. By 1645, he was a leading architect of the new model army, a revolutionary force based not on feudal loyalties, but on merit, discipline, and ideological conviction. This army would prove the decisive weapon against the king. Cromwell's rise was not merely military. His words carried weight in Parliament, where his voice thundered against compromise with the king. He came to believe that Charles could never be trusted, that his promises of reform were nothing but deceit. To save England, Cromwell concluded, the monarchy itself must fall. A man of faith, a soldier of iron destined to change a kingdom forever, his life embodied the fusion of religious conviction and political necessity. To his followers, he was a champion of liberty and godliness. To his enemies, he was a dangerous fanatic. With the execution of Charles I in 1649, Cromwell's path converged with the fate of the nation. He had fought not to reform monarchy, but to abolish it. The experiment that followed, the Commonwealth, was fragile, unprecedented, and fraught with peril. Yet it was an experiment Cromwell would shape with his sword, his faith, and his will. The scaffold at Whitehall marked not only the end of a king, but the beginning of a new chapter. For the first time in its long history, England stood without a monarch. The crown lay shattered, the throne vacant, and the destiny of the realm placed in the hands of Parliament and the men who had fought for its cause. But freedom would not come easily. The new Commonwealth faced enemies within and without. Royalists who dreamed of restoration, radicals who demanded broader democracy, and foreign powers that eyed England's weakness. Above all, it needed leadership, and leadership demanded both vision and resolve. Oliver Cromwell, the farmer turned general, the Puritan turned statesman, would emerge as the central figure of this uncertain age. His story is not simply one of victory or tyranny, but of the profound struggle to define what England could become. Was it to be a godly republic, a military dictatorship, or a brief interlude before monarchy returned? The answer would unfold in the years ahead. The drums of Whitehall had sounded not as the end of an era, but as the opening beat of a revolution. History is not merely the past, it is the mirror of our own times. If you find this story compelling, if the drama of England's struggle for liberty and power speaks to you, join us as we continue this journey through Cromwell's Commonwealth. Like this video, share it with those who love history, and subscribe so you will not miss the next chapter of this epic tale. Though the king had met his end upon the scaffold in 1649, the road to that moment had been long and blood-stained with conflict. To understand how a monarch, once draped in divine authority, came to kneel before his own people, one must return to the years before, when England first tore itself apart in civil war. For it was on the battlefields of the 1640s that Oliver Cromwell rose from obscurity, forged his Ironsides, and helped shape the new model army, a force that would not only defeat a king, but redefine the destiny of a kingdom. The execution of Charles I was still years away when England first plunged into open conflict. By 1642, the simmering tension between Crown and Parliament had finally erupted into war. The king raised his royal standard at Nottingham in August, calling loyal subjects to his side. Across the realm, men were forced to choose where their allegiance lay, with the king, defender of tradition and authority, or with Parliament, claiming to uphold the liberties of the nation. Families were divided, towns split, and old loyalties tested as the country slid into civil war. The first great clash came in October 1642 at Edgehill. Neither side was truly prepared for the scale of what was to come. The Royalist army, commanded by Prince Rupert of the Rhine, dazzled with its cavalry charges. Parliament's forces, led by the Earl of Essex, stood firm, but lacked the discipline to turn defense into victory. As the sun set over the Warwickshire fields, the battle ended without a clear winner, yet the outcome revealed much. The king still commanded loyalty, but Parliament's resistance was equally strong. England would not find a swift resolution. In the years that followed, the war spread across the kingdom. Skirmishes, sieges, and marches scarred the land from Cornwall to Yorkshire. The advantage shifted back and forth. For a time, it seemed the king might prevail, especially with the brilliance of Prince Rupert's cavalry. Yet Parliament found in Oliver Cromwell a commander unlike any other. Beginning as a modest cavalry officer, Cromwell proved himself both strict in discipline and unyielding in purpose. His troops, known as the Ironsides, were not simply soldiers, but men bound by faith, chosen for their character as much as their skill. Under Cromwell's leadership, they became a force of fearsome reputation, never easily routed, never quick to yield. Cromwell's rise was most clearly seen in 1644 at the Battle of Marston Moor. There, outside the city of York, the largest battle of the war unfolded. Royalists under Prince Rupert and the Marquis of Newcastle faced the combined forces of Parliament and their Scottish allies. The day was long and hard fought, with the Royalists pressing strongly at first. Yet as the evening drew in, Cromwell's cavalry charged with decisive effect. His Ironsides swept the field, breaking through Rupert's vaunted horsemen and turning the tide. By nightfall, Parliament had secured a decisive victory, and the north of England was lost to the king. Cromwell had proven himself not merely a capable commander, but the very backbone of Parliament's cause. Still, the war dragged on. The Earl of Essex and other commanders often fell into hesitation, unwilling to press advantage too far. Frustration grew in Parliament, as victory seemed always within reach, but never fully grasped. From this discontent emerged the idea of a new kind of army, professional, disciplined, and free from the half-hearted leadership of aristocratic commanders. In 1645, Parliament created the New Model Army. It was a revolutionary force. Soldiers paid regularly, officers chosen for merit rather than birth, bound by strict discipline and common purpose. Cromwell's influence shaped this army from the start. Though at first he clashed with Parliament's leaders, his vision of soldiers committed to both godliness and skill in arms won the day. The New Model Army reflected his ideals, an army of conviction, not convenience. It was this force that would march to Naseby in June 1645 and secure the future of Parliament's cause. Through these years, Cromwell transformed from country squire to national leader. His Ironsides became the model for an entire army, and his reputation as the Ironside general spread across the land. To his men, he was both stern and inspiring, demanding discipline, but also sharing in their hardships. To his enemies, he was relentless, the embodiment of Parliament's determination. By 1646, with the surrender of the king's last armies, the First Civil War had ended. Charles I, once secure in his divine right, now found himself a captive. The war had revealed more than the clash of swords and standards. It had exposed the deeper struggle over what England was to be. Was it a kingdom ruled solely by the will of one man, or a nation governed by laws and parliament? Cromwell stood at the heart of this struggle, his faith and his iron discipline forging the tools with which Parliament had triumphed. Yet the conflict was far from over. The fate of England and of Cromwell himself would be decided in the storm still to come. The surrender of the king's last armies in 1646 seemed, at first, to bring the struggle to an end. Charles was now a prisoner, Parliament stood victorious, and England held its breath for peace. Yet beneath the surface, the embers of conflict still glowed. The king, steadfast in his belief in divine right, would not yield. Parliament, divided between those seeking compromise and those demanding transformation, could not agree on the kingdom's future. What had begun as a military triumph soon unraveled into a political crisis, and within 2 years, England would find itself once more on the road to war. By 1646, the First Civil War had ended, and the king was a prisoner in the hands of Parliament. Yet peace did not follow. Charles I, though defeated on the battlefield, never abandoned the belief that his crown was divinely ordained. To him, captivity was a pause, not an ending. To Parliament, divided between moderates seeking compromise and radicals demanding transformation, the king's presence became both a burden and a temptation. At first, Charles was treated with dignity. Hopes lingered that he might accept constitutional limits, that a settlement could be reached to balance monarchy and Parliament. Negotiations unfolded in earnest, and the king played his part with charm and patience. Yet beneath his measured words lay calculation. He sought to exploit divisions among his captors, bargaining with one faction while secretly corresponding with another. He courted the Scots, offering concessions on religion in exchange for their support. He entertained proposals from moderate parliamentarians who feared the growing influence of the radical army. To each, he promised what they most desired, all the while holding to his conviction that once free, he could restore the crown's authority intact. This duplicity soon unraveled. In 1647, Charles managed to escape captivity and fled to the Isle of Wight, where he renewed intrigue with foreign powers and domestic allies. His flight exposed the limits of Parliament's control and confirmed the suspicions of men like Cromwell, who had long doubted the king's sincerity. Negotiations continued, but trust was broken. Charles seemed less a partner in peace than a catalyst for renewed war. By 1648, England was sliding once more into conflict. Royalist uprisings flared in Kent, Essex, and Wales. The Scots, persuaded by Charles's promises, invaded from the north. What followed was known as the Second Civil War, shorter than the first but no less decisive. The new model army, hardened by years of discipline, moved swiftly. At Preston, Cromwell's forces crushed the Scottish invasion, proving once again that the king's cause, though resilient, could not match the unity and determination of the army. Across the realm, the uprisings were stamped out, leaving Parliament victorious once more. Yet victory only deepened the divisions within Parliament. The moderates, often called Presbyterians, still hoped to reach a settlement with Charles. They feared that the removal of monarchy would unravel the very fabric of English society. They saw in compromise a path to stability, preserving both tradition and reform. The radicals, largely supported by the army and influenced by the Puritan cause, had grown weary of the king's maneuvers. To them, Charles was not a partner, but an obstacle. His repeated betrayals convinced them that no peace could endure while he lived. The tension between these camps reached breaking point. Soldiers petitioned for justice, insisting that the blood and sacrifice of the war must not be squandered on another false treaty. Pamphlets spread, voices grew louder, declaring that the king must be called to account before the nation. In their eyes, divine right could no longer shield him from human judgment. Cromwell, once cautious, now moved toward the same conclusion. He had sought reconciliation, but the Second Civil War convinced him that Charles's word could never be trusted. By the end of 1648, the fate of the king was sealed not by the sword, but by the collapse of confidence. The moderates were pushed aside in what became known as Pride's Purge, when the army physically excluded members of Parliament unwilling to try the king. What remained was the Rump Parliament, dominated by those resolved to bring Charles to trial. The stage was set for a moment unprecedented in English history. The king, once seen as God's anointed, would be judged by his subjects. The journey from the first clash at Edgehill to the courtroom at Westminster Hall had been long, and it revealed not only the failure of compromise, but the birth of a new political reality. The Second Civil War, brief but decisive, had shown that monarchy and Parliament could no longer coexist on equal terms. One must yield to the other. And in the winter of 1648, it was Charles who would face judgment. The conflict that had begun as a struggle over rights and grievances now reached its starkest question. Could England exist without a king? Cromwell and his allies believed the answer lay ahead, and their resolve would alter the destiny of the nation forever. The swords had been sheathed, but the question remained unresolved. The king was once more a prisoner, yet his defiance and repeated betrayals had convinced many that peace could never be secured while he lived. Parliament itself had been purged of those unwilling to face that truth, leaving behind a body prepared to attempt the unthinkable. And so, in the winter of 1648, as the kingdom trembled with uncertainty, preparations began for a trial unlike any in English history. The battlefield had given way to the courtroom, and there the fate of Charles Stuart would be decided. In January 1649, a chill hung over London, but it was not only the winter air that froze the city. It was the knowledge that a king was about to be tried by his own subjects. Westminster Hall, ancient and vast, had seen great feasts, coronations, and councils, yet never before such a proceeding. Wooden galleries were erected, benches lined with soldiers, and at the center of it all stood a chair, left conspicuously empty. It was the king's seat, waiting not as a throne but as a place for the accused. The hall itself became a stage for history. The High Court of Justice, created by the Rump Parliament and supported by the army, gathered under the stern gaze of its president, John Bradshaw. Around him sat commissioners, judges, lawyers, and parliamentarians, tasked with the impossible, to put a monarch on trial. Their very presence embodied defiance against centuries of tradition, for kings had always been seen as beyond human judgment. Yet now the balance of power had shifted. Charles Stuart, once believed to rule by divine right, was to answer for war and turmoil. When the king entered, he carried himself with dignity. He wore black with a white collar, and though guarded by soldiers, he held his head high. To many in the hall, his composure was unnerving. Charles did not recognize the authority of the court. Time and again, he refused to plead. He argued that no earthly tribunal could sit in judgment over him, that his authority came directly from God. His defiance turned the trial itself into a battle of principles, divine right versus accountability to the people. The evidence against him was laid out: his levying of war against Parliament, his secret dealings during captivity, his alliance with foreign forces. Witnesses spoke, documents were read, and the memory of the Second Civil War hung heavily over the proceedings. For Cromwell and his allies, Charles's repeated betrayals proved their point. He would never compromise, never share power, never accept a kingdom where Parliament held true authority. To spare him would invite endless cycles of rebellion. To condemn him was to declare that no one, not even a king, stood above the law. Among the commissioners, doubts lingered. Some hesitated, uneasy about condemning an anointed monarch. But Cromwell, though not always at the front of the chamber, was present in spirit and strategy. He and his fellow officers pressed firmly, reminding wavering members that the army stood behind the trial. For them, this was not merely about justice. It was about securing the future of the nation. In their view, the blood already shed in years of war demanded an answer, and that answer could not be found in reconciliation with a king who had proven himself untrustworthy. The trial stretched over several days. Each session drew crowds outside Westminster, citizens whispering anxiously about the outcome. Rumors spread that foreign ambassadors were appalled, that even some parliamentarians feared divine retribution. Yet the proceedings moved forward step by step toward their conclusion. The king remained resolute, neither begging nor conceding, but standing on his claim that the court had no right to judge him. His silence in the face of accusations only strengthened the resolve of those determined to see the trial completed. On January 27, 1649, the verdict was delivered. The court declared Charles Stuart guilty of treason against the realm of England. The decision was extraordinary, the first of its kind. The commissioners signed the death warrant, some with trembling hands, others with grim determination. Cromwell's signature stood among them, bold and unflinching. For him and his allies, the act was both necessity and statement. It declared that the law, upheld by Parliament and enforced by the army, could reach even the highest throne. Outside, the city braced for what was to come. Few could believe that the sentence would truly be carried out, yet the scaffold was already being prepared at Whitehall. The trial of Charles I had shattered centuries of belief, and its verdict reverberated far beyond England. To supporters of Parliament, it was the triumph of justice over tyranny. To royalists, it was unthinkable rebellion against the sacred order. To all, it marked a point of no return. Thus ended the trial of the king, not in compromise, but in judgment. The echoes of Westminster Hall would linger, for the choice made there altered forever the relationship between ruler and ruled. And in the shadow of that hall, Oliver Cromwell and his allies knew that history was watching. What they had done could never be undone, and the future of England would now be written on uncertain ground. The verdict had been delivered, the sentence signed, and the scaffold raised at Whitehall. With the fall of Charles I, England had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The monarchy, the keystone of centuries of government, was gone, and in its place, a vacuum opened at the heart of the realm. Out of that void, Parliament moved swiftly to fashion a new order. What followed was not restoration or compromise, but a bold declaration. England would henceforth be a Commonwealth and free state. The sound of the verdict in Westminster Hall still echoed when the kingdom was thrust into uncharted waters. With Charles I condemned and executed, the very structure of English government collapsed into something new. For centuries, the crown had been the centerpiece of authority, binding together parliament, church, and law. Now the crown was gone, and in its place the rump parliament moved swiftly to fill the void. The House of Lords, long the chamber of hereditary nobles, was declared obsolete. Its power was abolished, its voice silenced. No longer would birth and lineage alone dictate a seat in government. In its stead, the Commons, the representatives of towns and counties, claimed sole authority. On May 19, 1649, Parliament proclaimed England to be a Commonwealth and free state. For the first time in history, the nation formally announced it would be governed without king or lords. The declaration was both radical and precarious. To its authors, it was a triumph, the culmination of years of struggle. They saw themselves as founders of a new order, one in which the people, through their representatives, were sovereign. Yet the rump parliament was far from a popular assembly. It was the remnant of a once larger body, reduced and reshaped by the army's purge. Many viewed it less as the voice of the nation and more as the instrument of Cromwell and his allies. Still, in those early months, it stood as the symbol of England's Republican experiment. London was tense in the wake of the king's death. Markets reopened, courts resumed, but beneath daily routines lay uncertainty. Some rejoiced at the fall of monarchy, convinced they had entered an age of liberty. Others grieved, horrified by what they saw as rebellion against God's order. Across the shires, loyalty to the crown lingered. In taverns and churches, people whispered of the late king as a martyr. Abroad, European courts watched with astonishment. A great power had dethroned and executed its monarch, declaring itself a republic in a continent still ruled by kings. To allies and rivals alike, England seemed both bold and unstable. Inside the walls of Parliament, the task of governance proved daunting. The rump passed acts to secure the new regime, outlawing declarations of loyalty to the Stuarts and reinforcing allegiance to the Commonwealth. They established a Council of State, an executive body of 41 members charged with administering foreign policy, the army, and the law. This council, in theory, represented collective leadership, but in practice it leaned heavily on Cromwell and the military men who had brought victory. The army loomed over every decision. Its presence in London, disciplined and loyal, ensured the survival of the new order. Officers like Cromwell, Henry Ireton, and Thomas Harrison shaped debates not only with persuasion, but with the quiet reminder that force was at their disposal. For many parliamentarians, this reliance on soldiers was troubling. The Commonwealth had been founded in the name of liberty, yet it rested on the power of men in uniform. Even so, the rump sought to project stability. It reformed taxation, reorganized trade, and began to strengthen the navy, knowing that foreign conflict might soon test the fragile state. The language of their declarations was lofty. The people were now free, their government chosen by them, not imposed from above. Yet the gap between rhetoric and reality was wide. The franchise remained narrow, limited to property owners. Radicals who had fought for broader democracy, such as the Levelers, were disappointed, some even outraged. They had imagined a republic where all voices might be heard, but instead saw a parliament still dominated by the wealthy and the cautious. For Cromwell, the establishment of the Commonwealth was both victory and challenge. He had long believed that the king must fall for England to be saved, but the creation of a republic was not an end in itself. It was the beginning of a larger mission to secure godly government, to defend the nation against its enemies, and to ensure that the sacrifices of war were not wasted. He was not yet Lord Protector, not yet the dominant ruler he would become, but already his shadow stretched over the new regime. His presence reassured some and alarmed others, for it was clear that the Commonwealth would not survive without the strength of the army he commanded. Thus England entered its republican experiment. The monarchy and House of Lords were gone, swept aside by acts of Parliament and the will of the army. What remained was fragile, a government without precedent, a people divided, a future uncertain. But for the moment, the Commonwealth stood, bold in its declaration that England was a free state, no longer bound to the crown. It was an experiment born in the tumult of war and carried forward by men convinced they were instruments of Providence. The world watched, and England held its breath as a republic took its first steps into history. The Commonwealth had been proclaimed, its institutions hurriedly assembled, and its survival secured by the shadow of the army. Yet declaring a republic was one thing, governing it was another. With the king gone, new voices rushed to fill the silence, voices of soldiers, preachers, and common people who demanded that the victory deliver more than a change of rulers. It was in this uncertain atmosphere that the first great challenges to the Commonwealth arose, testing the resolve of Cromwell and his allies from within. The birth of the Commonwealth did not mean unity. If anything, the removal of the king exposed the fault lines that had always run through the kingdom. Without a monarch to oppose, Parliament and the army now faced the challenge of governing a restless people whose expectations for freedom were as varied as their backgrounds. Among the loudest voices were the Levelers. They had fought in the wars as common soldiers, shed blood for Parliament's cause, and now demanded that the victory deliver something more than a republic ruled by the wealthy. They called for expanded suffrage, equality before the law, and greater accountability of leaders. To the Levelers, liberty was not the privilege of landowners, but the right of all Englishmen. Their pamphlets, filled with bold arguments and plain language, circulated widely through taverns, markets, and military camps. They urged that the sacrifices of ordinary men must be honored with genuine representation. In 1649, soldiers sympathetic to the Leveler cause mutinied in parts of the new model army. They believed the Commonwealth betrayed the promises of justice and equality that had stirred them in battle. Cromwell, once admired by them as a champion of godly purpose, now appeared to stand with the Rump Parliament against their demands. For Cromwell and his allies, the Levelers' vision was dangerous. It threatened to dissolve the fragile order of the Commonwealth into chaos, to replace discipline with disorder. Faced with mutiny, Cromwell acted with firm resolve. The revolts were swiftly suppressed, their leaders imprisoned, their influence curtailed. The message was clear. The Commonwealth would not be reshaped into a democracy of the multitude. Yet political radicalism was only one part of the storm. Religious ferment also swept across England. The fall of the monarchy and the weakening of church authority unleashed a flood of spiritual experimentation. Groups once on the margins now emerged boldly into public life. Among them were the Quakers, followers of George Fox, who preached that every person carried an inner light of divine truth. Rejecting the authority of clergy and the rituals of established churches, they met in silence, waiting for the Spirit to move. To many, their gatherings seemed unsettling, even subversive. Their refusal to remove hats before magistrates or swear oaths appeared to defy social order. But to their adherents, Quaker faith offered a direct, unmediated connection to God. Another group, the Fifth Monarchists, carried radicalism to a different extreme. They believed that history was unfolding according to the prophecy in the book of Daniel. The fall of 4 great empires would be followed by the rule of Christ himself. the fifth monarchy. In their eyes, the Commonwealth was but a stepping stone to a godly kingdom on earth, and human rulers were merely temporary instruments. They agitated for sweeping change, demanding strict enforcement of biblical law, and preparing themselves for the imminent reign of the saints. Their zeal was both a source of inspiration and of fear, for it suggested that no government short of divine rule could satisfy their expectations. The spread of such movements created both hope and unease. For some, the freedom to gather and worship without bishops or kings was the very essence of the Commonwealth's promise. For others, it was a sign that the nation was slipping into fragmentation, each sect claiming truth against all others. Cromwell himself was torn. He valued liberty of conscience, often speaking against persecution for faith. Yet he feared that unchecked religious enthusiasm could tear apart the unity of the new republic. His policy was one of cautious tolerance, allowing space for diversity but clamping down when dissent threatened order or the authority of Parliament. This balancing act defined the early years of the Commonwealth. On one side stood reformers and radicals, pressing for a broader democracy and a deeper religious revolution. On the other stood Cromwell and the army, determined to preserve stability and the gains of war. The struggle was not simply political, it was spiritual and cultural, shaping how the English people understood liberty, faith, and authority. By 1650, the Commonwealth was a state both bold and fragile. It had removed monarchy and lords, but it had not silenced the voices of those who wanted more. In every marketplace and meeting house, debates continued. What was freedom? Was it the right to vote, to preach, to live without bishops, or to wait for the kingdom of Christ? The answers varied, and the government's response was never simple. Cromwell's hand was firm, but his conscience was restless. He dreamed of a godly nation, yet he feared that unbridled freedom might destroy the very cause he had fought to secure. Thus, the Commonwealth stood at a crossroads. Its survival depended not only on resisting royalist plots or foreign threats, but also on navigating the turbulent seas of its own people's expectations. The levelers had been silenced, but their words lingered. The Quakers and Fifth Monarchists could not be ignored, their fervor spreading from village to city. England was alive with new ideas, new faiths, and new demands. The question was whether the fragile republic could harness that energy or whether it would be torn apart by it. The debates within England had shaken the foundations of the new republic, but threats did not come from within alone. Beyond its shores and across its borders, the Commonwealth faced enemies who refused to accept the fall of monarchy. Royalist exiles plotted, Ireland seethed with resistance, and Scotland raised the banner of Charles II. If the experiment in republican rule was to survive, it would have to be defended not only in Parliament and pulpits, but also on the battlefield. And it was Oliver Cromwell, already the sword of the Revolution, who would once again be called to lead. The survival of the Commonwealth demanded more than declarations in Westminster. It had to prove itself not only to its citizens, but to its neighbors across the British Isles. The monarchy might have been dismantled in London, but in Ireland and Scotland the royalist cause remained alive, carried forward by loyal nobles, restless soldiers, and the unyielding belief that Charles Stuart's son, now styling himself Charles II, would reclaim his father's throne. For Oliver Cromwell and the leaders of the new republic, these challenges threatened to unravel the fragile state before it could take root. The wars that followed would test both the resolve of the Commonwealth and the character of its most powerful general. Cromwell's first great campaign as the champion of the new order took him across the Irish Sea in 1649. Ireland had long been a land of tension between native Irish, Old English Catholics, Protestant settlers, and royalist nobles. During the years of the English Civil War, Ireland had slipped further into chaos, with shifting alliances and local uprisings. Now it had become a rallying ground for those who rejected the Commonwealth and sought to restore the Stuarts. To Cromwell, Ireland was both a danger and an opportunity. If subdued, it could no longer serve as a base for royalist plots or foreign intervention. If left unchecked, it might provide the spark for renewed war on English soil. Landing with the new model army, Cromwell moved decisively. At Drogheda in September 1649, his forces confronted a garrison holding the town for the royalist cause. The assault was fierce, and when the defenders were overwhelmed, the outcome sent shockwaves across Ireland and England alike. For some, it was hailed as divine judgment, a blow that demonstrated the might and resolve of the new Commonwealth. For others, it was remembered as a harsh lesson, a moment when Cromwell's commitment to order and discipline crossed into severity. The debate over Drogheda would linger for centuries, shaping how his name was remembered in Ireland and beyond. A month later, at Wexford, the pattern repeated. The town was a stronghold of royalist resistance and a potential harbor for foreign support. Negotiations broke down, and the assault that followed ended with the defenders scattered and the port secured. Once again, Cromwell justified his actions as necessary to break the resistance swiftly and prevent greater bloodshed through prolonged war. Yet critics then and later saw in Wexford the heavy hand of a general who allowed no space for mercy when confronted with rebellion. In the months that followed, his army advanced across the island, capturing towns and strongholds, gradually reducing Ireland to submission. By 1650, Cromwell was recalled from Ireland, his task largely complete, though the conflict there would drag on under his lieutenants. His eyes turned northward to Scotland. The Scots, once allies of Parliament, had been alienated by the execution of Charles I. To them, the act was not the dawn of liberty, but an outrage against God's anointed. They rallied around Charles II, proclaiming him their rightful king and preparing to march south. For the Commonwealth, this was an existential threat. A restored Stuart monarchy supported by Scottish arms could undo everything won since 1649. Cromwell marched into Scotland at the head of the new model army, hardened by campaigns and confident in its cause. The Scottish army, larger and well-positioned, awaited him near Dunbar. The situation seemed dire. The English forces were trapped between the sea and the hills, their supply lines stretched thin. Yet in the early morning of September 3, 1650, Cromwell struck. His cavalry charged down the slopes, his infantry pressed forward with discipline, and the Scottish lines broke under the assault. The Battle of Dunbar was a stunning victory, one Cromwell himself described as a marvelous mercy. Against the odds, the Commonwealth had triumphed, and the road to Edinburgh lay open. The following year brought the decisive confrontation. Charles II, crowned king in Scotland, led his forces south into England, seeking to ignite royalist support. Cromwell pursued, and the two armies met at Worcester on September 3, 1651. Exactly 1 year to the day after Dunbar. Once again, the discipline of the new model army proved unmatched. The royalist cause collapsed, and Charles II barely escaped, fleeing into exile across the Channel. Worcester was more than a battle. It was the end of the civil wars. With Scotland subdued and Ireland largely under control, the Commonwealth stood unchallenged across the British Isles. These campaigns confirmed Cromwell's reputation as the foremost military leader of his age. To his supporters, his victories were providential, proof that God had blessed the Commonwealth and rejected the Stuart cause. To his critics, they demonstrated the overwhelming force of an army that increasingly overshadowed civil authority. Whatever the interpretation, the facts were plain. Cromwell had secured England's Republican experiment through arms as well as laws. The Commonwealth, fragile in its infancy, now commanded the entire island realm. Yet the legacy of these campaigns was complex. In Ireland, memories of Drogheda and Wexford hardened divisions, ensuring that Cromwell's name would be reviled by generations to come. In Scotland, resentment lingered at the subjugation of a nation that had once been an ally. Even in England, the reliance on military might raise questions about whether liberty had truly been won or whether it had merely traded one form of authority for another. Still, in the early 1650s, the sense of triumph was undeniable. For the first time, a government without king or lords ruled not just England but the entire British Isles. The Commonwealth had survived its first great tests, and Oliver Cromwell had emerged not only as its defender, but as its indispensable leader. The wars were over, but the question remained: could peace be secured, and could the new republic endure? The answers would soon be tested in the halls of Parliament and in the restless hearts of the people. The battlefields of Ireland and Scotland had secured the Commonwealth's survival at home, but victory on land was not enough. A republic born of war could not remain insular. Its destiny would be tested on the seas and in the courts of Europe. Having subdued royalist threats within the British Isles, Cromwell and his allies now turned outward, determined to prove that their new state could stand among the powers of the world. The Commonwealth, having secured its authority across England, Ireland, and Scotland, now turned outward. No republic could survive in isolation. The fate of this new order would also be judged on the seas and in the councils of Europe. For Cromwell and his allies, the struggle was not only military or political, but deeply spiritual. They imagined England as more than a nation freed from monarchy. It was to be a godly republic, a beacon of righteousness in a continent still ruled by kings. Yet ambition quickly met resistance. Across the North Sea stood the Dutch Republic, a state that in many ways mirrored England's new experiment. The Netherlands, too, had thrown off monarchy, forging a republic that thrived on commerce and maritime strength. But similarity did not make them allies. On the contrary, it made them rivals. Both sought control of the seas. Both claimed dominance in trade routes that stretched from the Baltic to the East Indies. The stage was set for collision. The spark came in 1651 with the Navigation Act, passed by the Rump Parliament. This law required that goods imported into England be carried on English ships or on vessels from the country of origin. It struck directly at Dutch merchants, whose fleets dominated European trade. For the Dutch, it was an intolerable affront. For the English, it was a necessary measure to secure economic independence and assert the Commonwealth's power. By 1652, tensions boiled over into open war, the First Anglo-Dutch War. The conflict unfolded not on English soil, but on the waves of the Channel and the North Sea. There, vast fleets clashed in thunderous battles, their sails crowding the horizon. The Dutch, led by Admiral Martin Tromp, brought unmatched seamanship, honed by decades of naval struggle against Spain. The English, commanded by Robert Blake and George Monk, relied on discipline and the emerging doctrine of line of battle. Tactics, in which ships sailed in formation to unleash their broadsides with devastating effect. The war was fierce, marked by alternating victories. At first, the Dutch seemed to hold the advantage, their fleets larger and more experienced, but gradually the Commonwealth Navy gained ground. Blake's reorganization, supported by the resources of Parliament, created a fleet capable of challenging Dutch mastery. Battles off Dungeness, Portland, and the Gabbard tested both sides. At Scheveningen in 1653, Tromp himself fell in combat, and though the Dutch fought valiantly, England claimed the strategic upper hand. The outcome was not merely naval, it was symbolic. The Commonwealth proved that its authority extended beyond the island, that it could face one of Europe's great maritime powers and emerge stronger. In 1654, peace was signed at Westminster. The Dutch accepted terms that recognized the Navigation Act and acknowledged England's rising power, though rivalry between the two republics would continue for decades. For the moment, the Commonwealth had secured both its trade routes and its reputation as a naval force to be reckoned with. These victories at sea reinforced Cromwell's vision of a godly republic that could speak with authority in Europe. He believed that England had been chosen for a special role, not merely to defend itself, but to shape the destiny of nations. In speeches and letters, he often framed foreign policy as part of divine providence, a mission to protect the Protestant cause and resist the Catholic monarchies that encircled the continent. To allies, he offered solidarity; to enemies, warning. This vision was not without contradiction. England, in seeking to build a godly republic, was compelled to act as a great power, pursuing trade, colonies, and influence like the monarchies it condemned. Yet for Cromwell and his supporters, the difference lay in intent. The Commonwealth was not a dynasty seeking glory for a crown, but a state founded on the will of Parliament and the providence of God. To them, commerce, war, and diplomacy were all instruments in a larger design. By the mid-1650s, England stood transformed. The Republic had not only crushed royalist resistance at home, but challenged the Dutch abroad. Its navy sailed proudly as a symbol of new strength. Its merchants prospered under protective laws, and its leaders dreamed of alliances that would bind Protestant Europe together. Though the Commonwealth remained contested and fragile, it had announced itself to the world. No longer a kingdom ruled by tradition, England was now a republic that demanded recognition. Yet the victories also raised questions. Could a nation so dependent on the army and navy claim to embody liberty? Could a godly republic survive in a world where trade and power so often dictated policy? These were tensions that Cromwell would wrestle with for the rest of his career. For the moment, however, the Commonwealth stood tall, its banners flying at sea, its voice heard across Europe. England had taken its first steps as a power without kings, and the world was learning to reckon with the force of a new republic. The victories at sea had secured England's place among Europe's powers, but triumph abroad could not disguise the unrest at home. The Commonwealth, forged in war and upheld by faith, still lacked the stable foundation of lasting governance. Within Westminster, the Rump Parliament clung to power, slow to reform and deaf to the demands of soldiers and citizens alike. For Cromwell, who believed England's destiny was to be not only strong but godly, the frustrations of politics would soon prove as great a challenge as any battle. By 1653, the Commonwealth had defeated its enemies abroad and subdued its rivals at home. Yet within the walls of Westminster, a new battle was being fought. The Rump Parliament, once the instrument of revolution, lingered on, reluctant to surrender its hold on power. It had abolished the monarchy, dismantled the House of Lords, and declared England a free state. But now, instead of building a lasting constitution, it drifted in endless debates, clinging to privileges and delaying reforms. For Oliver Cromwell, who had carried the weight of war across Ireland, Scotland, and the seas, this stagnation was intolerable. The soldiers who had shed blood for Parliament demanded change. The people who had endured years of upheaval looked for new order, yet the Rump seemed incapable of delivering. Its members quarreled over property settlements, delayed the drafting of new laws, and resisted any call to dissolve themselves for fresh elections. Many appeared more interested in preserving their seats than in securing the future of the Commonwealth. To Cromwell, who believed he was entrusted with a divine mission, the Rump had become not a guardian of liberty, but an obstacle to it. On April 20th, 1653, Cromwell entered the House of Commons, accompanied by soldiers of the new model army. The chamber was in session, members seated in their customary rows, the speaker presiding. At first, Cromwell sat quietly, listening. The debate wandered from one petty matter to another, a far cry from the vision of a godly republic he carried in his heart. Slowly, his patience broke. Rising to his feet, he addressed the chamber. His words were heavy with conviction. "You have sat too long for any good you have been doing," he thundered. "In the name of God, go." The chamber erupted in shock. Members shouted in protest, some rising to confront him. Cromwell pointed at them, his voice unrelenting. He accused them of corruption, of self-interest, of betraying the cause for which so many had fought. Soldiers moved forward, their presence impossible to ignore. The speaker was ordered from his chair. One by one, members filed out under the stern gaze of Cromwell's men. The doors of the chamber closed behind them, and the Rump Parliament was dissolved. The moment was dramatic, almost theatrical, but its meaning was unmistakable. Power had shifted from elected representatives, however flawed, to the army and to Cromwell himself. For some, this was a betrayal of the very principles of the Commonwealth. Had not Parliament fought against the arbitrary power of a king, only to see that authority replaced by the will of a general? For others, it was a necessary act, a cleansing of a corrupt body that had lost sight of its purpose. Either way, the cry that echoed through Westminster that day marked the end of one experiment and the beginning of another. In the days that followed, Cromwell sought to justify his action. He did not deny the gravity of dismissing Parliament by force, but he argued it was done out of duty, not ambition. He claimed that the Rump had failed to govern in the spirit of godliness, that it had obstructed reform, and that God had placed the burden on him to act. His words found resonance with many in the army, who had long felt the Rump ignored their sacrifices. Yet critics whispered that Cromwell had crossed a line, that he had moved from servant of Parliament to master of it. In place of the Rump, a new experiment was attempted, the nominated assembly, sometimes called the bare-bones Parliament, after one of its more colorful members. Its members were not elected, but chosen, many from among the godly and the devout. Cromwell hoped this gathering would embody the spirit of reform, free from corruption and self-interest. But the shadow of April 20th lingered. The image of Cromwell standing in the Commons, flanked by soldiers, declaring the end of parliamentary authority, remained etched in memory. The dissolution of the rump revealed the central paradox of the Commonwealth. It had been born in the name of liberty and representation, yet it survived only by the strength of the sword. Cromwell, who had risen to power through faith and discipline, now found himself ruling by military force. His cry of, "In the name of God, go!" was not only an indictment of Parliament, but also a declaration of where true authority now lay, not in the chamber of Westminster, but in the hands of the army and its chosen leader. Thus, the Commonwealth entered a new phase. What had begun as a republic of laws and institutions now bent under the weight of military power. Cromwell did not yet wear a crown nor claim the title of king, but in the spring of 1653, he stood as the undisputed master of England's fate. The path ahead was uncertain, the challenges immense, but one truth was clear. The dream of a godly republic would now be pursued under the watchful eye of Oliver Cromwell and the soldiers who followed him. The echoes of Cromwell's command still lingered in Westminster after the rump was swept aside. The chamber lay empty, its debates silenced, but the question of governance remained. England could not live forever under the shadow of soldiers alone. A new framework was needed, something more enduring than the force of arms, an order that could give shape and legitimacy to the fragile Commonwealth. Out of this necessity, the idea of a written constitution began to take form, and with it, a new office that would place Cromwell at the heart of England's destiny. The dismissal of the Rump Parliament left a void at the heart of England's government. The monarchy had been abolished, the Lords cast aside, and now even the Commons had been silenced. For a brief moment, power rested only in the hands of the army and its generals. But neither Cromwell nor his allies wished to appear as naked usurpers. They needed a new framework, a foundation that could legitimize authority and secure the fragile republic. Out of this necessity was born something unprecedented in English history, a written constitution. In December 1653, the instrument of government was introduced. Drafted largely by army officers and lawyers, it attempted to provide structure to a state that had been governed by improvisation since the king's death. At its core, the document created a new office, the Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland. Into that role stepped Oliver Cromwell. He was not crowned, no scepter was placed in his hand, no throne was set beneath him. Yet he now stood as the head of state, with powers greater than those of any general, and responsibilities heavier than those of any mere magistrate. The instrument balanced authority between the Protector, a council of state, and a reformed parliament. The Protector would command the armed forces, conduct foreign policy, and ensure the execution of laws. The council, composed of trusted advisors, would act as a check and partner in governance. Parliament, to be summoned every 3 years, retained legislative power, but was bound within the new constitutional framework. For the first time, England had a written charter setting the limits and duties of government. To Cromwell, this was not monarchy reborn, but something higher. He did not wear the crown, yet he wielded influence beyond any king of the past. Observers soon captured the paradox in words. Not a king, but more than a general. He styled himself humbly as servant of the Commonwealth, yet in practice he embodied the unity of executive and military power. He was addressed as His Highness, received ambassadors as a sovereign, and signed treaties in the name of the Republic. The trappings of royalty were absent, but the substance of authority was undeniable. The proclamation of Cromwell as Lord Protector was met with mixed reactions. Among supporters, it brought relief. After years of uncertainty, England had at last a stable figure of leadership. The army was satisfied, its commander secured at the pinnacle of power. Merchants welcomed the continuity, for trade and naval strength required firm government. Abroad, foreign courts hesitated, but soon recognized the protectorate, treating Cromwell as the equal of kings and princes. But suspicion lingered. For Republicans who had dreamed of broad parliamentary government, the new order seemed a betrayal. Was this not monarchy in another guise? They pointed to Cromwell's residence in Whitehall, his bodyguards, his ceremonies, and wondered how different it truly was from the rule of a king. Even within Parliament, murmurs of discontent grew as members tested the limits of the Protector's patience. Cromwell himself insisted that he sought no crown, that he carried only the burden thrust upon him by Providence. yet his position rested on the army's support, and the line between protector and ruler was thin indeed. Still, the instrument of government marked a turning point. For the first time, England lived under a written constitution. However fragile and contested, it sought to combine stability with accountability, authority with principle. In practice, it gave Cromwell the space to pursue his vision: the defense of the Commonwealth, the promotion of religious liberty for the godly, and the strengthening of England's place in Europe. As Lord Protector, Cromwell moved with a gravity that even kings had rarely achieved. He was conscious always of the eye of history, often reminding his council that they were not building merely for the present, but for generations to come. He believed himself an instrument in God's hands, chosen to guide the nation through its perilous experiment. His rule was not gilded with ceremony, but clothed in purpose. To friend and foe alike, he represented the paradox of the age: a man who denied kingship, yet wielded kingly power; a soldier who laid down the sword in words, yet governed through its shadow. Thus, by the close of 1653, England had crossed another threshold. The republic that had begun in revolution now rested on the shoulders of a single figure, not a king, but more than a general, the Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell. The future of the Commonwealth, and perhaps of republican government itself, would rise or fall with him. The instrument of government had given Cromwell a title and a framework, but titles alone could not govern a restless nation. Having assumed the role of Lord Protector, he now faced the far greater task of turning theory into practice, of proving that the Commonwealth could endure not merely on parchment, but in the daily lives of its people and in the gaze of the world beyond. It was in the years that followed that Cromwell's deepest convictions and his most controversial choices would come to define his protectorate. As Lord Protector, Cromwell now faced the burden of translating ideals into governance. The wars were largely won, the Constitution drafted, but the challenge of ruling a divided people lay before him. His protectorate, beginning in December 1653, became both experiment and paradox, an attempt to fashion a godly republic in a nation weary of war, tradition, and endless debate. It was here that Cromwell's deepest convictions and his most controversial policies came to life. Religion was always at the heart of his vision. Cromwell believed England had been chosen for a divine purpose, and the Commonwealth was to be a vessel of godliness. Within this framework, he extended a measure of tolerance unusual for his age. Protestants of varied stripes, Independents, Baptists, even Quakers, found a degree of freedom to worship as conscience dictated. To Cromwell, liberty of conscience was sacred, provided that worship did not threaten the stability of the state. He invited Jewish communities, long banished from England since the Middle Ages, to return, seeing in their presence both an act of justice and a step toward a broader divine plan. Yet, tolerance had limits. Toward Roman Catholicism, Cromwell remained unyielding. To him, the Catholic faith was not merely a spiritual alternative, but a political danger tied to the designs of Spain and the exiled Stuarts. In Ireland, where Catholic loyalty had intertwined with royalist resistance, repression remained harsh. Cromwell's government restricted Catholic worship, confiscated lands, and sought to weaken its influence. Even in England, Catholics were monitored with suspicion, barred from office, and forced to live under penalties. Thus, his protectorate stood as both pioneering in its vision of religious liberty and uncompromising in its hostility to Rome. This pursuit of godliness extended beyond the church and into daily life. Cromwell and his allies sought to reshape society according to Puritan ideals. Theaters were closed, their plays condemned as frivolous or corrupting. Public drunkenness was punished, taverns watched with scrutiny, and laws were enacted to curb gambling, swearing, and immorality. Sundays were guarded as sacred, with markets and amusements forbidden. In the streets of London and the villages of the shires, constables enforced codes of behavior that reflected Puritan piety. To some, this discipline promised moral renewal. They saw in it a chance to raise a generation free from the excesses of courtly decadence and worldly vanity. To others, it felt suffocating, as though joy itself had been legislated away. Music and theater, long part of English culture, fell silent. The alehouse, a place of fellowship for common folk, was shadowed by suspicion. Cromwell himself, though personally moderate in some habits, believed such restraint necessary for a godly society. In his eyes, liberty was not license, and true freedom was found in obedience to divine order. Yet the Protectorate was not solely introspective. Cromwell understood that England's destiny reached far beyond its shores. His foreign policy was bold, aimed at elevating the Commonwealth as a power to be reckoned with. He allied with France against Spain, uniting Protestant ambition with pragmatic strategy. The long conflict between Bourbon and Habsburg gave England a chance to tip the scales, and Cromwell seized it. In 1655, he launched what came to be called the Western Design, a grand expedition to the Caribbean intended to strike at Spain's colonial empire. The fleet, carrying soldiers and sailors across the Atlantic, embodied the Commonwealth's determination to expand its reach. Though the campaign faltered at Hispaniola, it captured Jamaica, a prize that would remain in English hands long after the Protectorate had vanished. This foothold in the New World marked the beginning of England's imperial ambitions, a legacy far greater than Cromwell could have imagined. Closer to home, the Navy became the jewel of his policy. Building on the victories of the First Anglo-Dutch War, Cromwell strengthened the fleet, making it the shield of trade and the spear of diplomacy. English ships patrolled the Channel and the Mediterranean, challenging pirates, protecting merchants, and displaying the Commonwealth's strength. When English sailors seized treasure ships from Spain, it was not merely profit, but proof that England could stand with the great powers of Europe. The diplomacy of the Protectorate reflected Cromwell's dual nature, both devout and pragmatic. He dreamed of a Protestant League, a fellowship of reformed nations standing against Catholic monarchies. At the same time, he pursued alliances with Catholic France when it served the Commonwealth's interests. He supported Protestant rebels in Piedmont, sending aid and threatening force when they were persecuted. His voice carried weight in courts across Europe, for even monarchs recognized that England, under Cromwell, had become a force not to be ignored. At home, the effects of this foreign policy were felt in commerce and confidence. Merchants prospered under protection of the Navigation Acts. Colonies in the Americas grew under the shadow of an expanding fleet. For ordinary Englishmen, the sense that their country had emerged from isolation into prominence was palpable. Even critics of Cromwell's rule admitted that he had raised England's stature among nations. Yet these achievements did not silence unease. The restrictions on culture, the weight of military oversight, and the concentration of power in one man stirred discontent. Some whispered that Cromwell had exchanged the tyranny of kings for the tyranny of a general cloaked in godly rhetoric. Others feared that his vision, noble though it was, could not endure beyond his lifetime. Still, during his years as Lord Protector, England stood firm, disciplined at home, and respected abroad. In Cromwell's Protectorate, contradictions abounded: tolerance and persecution, liberty and restraint, humility and authority. He was not a king, yet ruled like one. He was a soldier, yet dreamed of peace. He championed conscience, yet imposed order. His governance left no one indifferent. To some, it was the dawning of a new age. To others, a joyless experiment doomed to collapse. But all could see that Oliver Cromwell, as Lord Protector, had carved a new place for England in history. An island nation reborn as a power, guided by faith, discipline, and ambition. The successes of Cromwell's Protectorate, its moral rigor at home, its bold ventures abroad, its vision of a godly republic, gave England a stature it had not known before. Yet beneath the surface of order and achievement, tensions smoldered. The same authority that made Cromwell respected also made him feared, and the balance between liberty and control grew ever harder to sustain. Soon the very foundations of his rule would be tested, not on distant battlefields or foreign seas, but in the restless chambers of Parliament and in the whispered plots against his life. The Protectorate, though clothed in the authority of the instrument of government, was never free from strain. From its first days, Oliver Cromwell found himself caught between the ideals of parliamentary rule and the realities of military power. His vision of a godly republic required cooperation, yet mistrust ran deep on every side. Parliament resented the dominance of the army, while the army distrusted any assembly that might weaken the Commonwealth's hard-won stability. In this tension lay the central struggle of Cromwell's later years. The first Protectorate Parliament, summoned in 1654, met with high hopes. It was to be the proving ground of the new Constitution, a body of elected representatives working alongside the Lord Protector and his council. But harmony quickly dissolved into discord. Members questioned the legitimacy of the instrument, challenging the authority that gave Cromwell his power. They pressed for broader freedoms, and some sought to reopen debates long since settled, whether the king's execution had been lawful, whether the Commonwealth should even exist. For Cromwell, who saw himself as the guardian of the nation's fragile peace, such disputes threatened not only government, but Providence itself. After 5 months of fruitless quarrels, he dissolved the assembly. In its place came new experiments, parliaments called and dismissed, councils reshaped, ordinances enacted by decree. Each time, Cromwell insisted he sought only to preserve order, yet the pattern revealed the paradox of his rule. He championed liberty of conscience, but silenced voices he deemed dangerous. The Protectorate endured not through consent alone, but through the ever-present shadow of the army. His challenges were not limited to politics. Plots simmered against him from royalists who had never abandoned the Stuart cause, and from Republicans who saw in him the makings of a tyrant. Assassination attempts were uncovered, conspiracies foiled at the last moment. Cromwell moved cautiously, surrounding himself with guards and relying on intelligence networks to unearth threats. Still, he carried himself with the air of a man resigned to Providence, declaring that his life was in God's hands. Each plot, though alarming, only reinforced the conviction of his followers that he was chosen for a destiny larger than any crown could confer. The greatest trial of his authority came not from daggers in the dark, but from a crown offered in daylight. By 1657, the Protectorate faced exhaustion. The Constitution of 1653 had failed to provide lasting stability. Many in Parliament and the army alike believed that only a return to monarchy in some form could bring order. In the spring of that year, the humble petition and advice was presented to Cromwell. It offered him the crown of England, along with the title of king, a restructured parliament, and the promise of hereditary succession. The proposal was radical and conservative at once. To royalists, it was proof that England could not escape its traditions. To Republicans, it was betrayal. To Cromwell, it was a temptation and a burden. He wrestled with the offer for weeks, consulting his conscience, his counsel, and his God. In the throne room at Whitehall, he was told that the nation longed for a settled form of government, that the name of king carried legitimacy no other title could provide. His allies urged him to accept, seeing in it the chance to bind England to stability at last. Yet Cromwell refused. He declared that he could not in good conscience take the crown, for it would betray the cause for which so much had been sacrificed. "I will not build Jericho again," he is said to have remarked, invoking the biblical city that symbolized defiance of God's will. And so the crown, once torn from Charles I's head on the scaffold, remained unclaimed. Cromwell accepted instead the continuation of his role as Lord Protector under a revised constitution. In rejecting the crown, Cromwell preserved his image as a man apart from worldly ambition. He insisted that he sought not the title of king, but the substance of godly government. Yet in truth, he already wielded powers as great as any monarch. He summoned and dismissed parliaments, commanded armies, directed foreign policy, and ruled from Whitehall with all the dignity of sovereignty. He rejected a crown but embraced power, historians would later write, capturing the paradox that defined him. The later years of his protectorate were marked by this tension. Supporters praised him as the bulwark of order, the man who had guided England through storms of war into a new age of prominence. Critics saw only hypocrisy, a soldier cloaked in piety who had become what he once opposed. Foreign envoys addressed him as a prince. Poets and preachers invoked him as a chosen instrument of God. The people, weary and divided, saw in him both savior and oppressor. By the late 1650s, Cromwell's health began to fail, but his grip on power remained firm. The Commonwealth, reshaped into the Protectorate, was inseparable from his person. His rejection of the crown had not diminished his authority. It had instead crowned him with a different kind of majesty, the majesty of command without coronation, of leadership rooted in conviction as much as in force. Thus, the story of Cromwell's rule reached its height in paradox. He dissolved parliaments in the name of liberty, suppressed dissent in the name of conscience, and refused a crown while exercising the full weight of sovereignty. His protectorate was both the fulfillment and the contradiction of the revolution that birthed it. England had not restored its monarchy, but in Oliver Cromwell it had found something just as commanding, a ruler who stood outside tradition, yet loomed as large as any king in its history. The paradox of Cromwell's protectorate, rejecting a crown while ruling with kingly power, defined the height of his authority. Yet even as he stood unmatched in England, time and burden began to take their toll. The revolution that had carried him to power could not shield him from the frailty of the flesh, nor from the sorrows of the heart. And so, in the twilight of his years, the man who had toppled kings and forged a republic faced his final struggle, not against armies or parliaments, but against the weight of age, grief, and destiny itself. By the late 1650s, Oliver Cromwell stood at the height of his power, yet also at the edge of his strength. Years of war, ceaseless governance, and the unrelenting burdens of authority had worn down both body and spirit. He had risen from a minor country gentleman to the most powerful man in the British Isles, but the ascent had come at immense cost. Now, as Lord Protector, he carried the weight of a fractured nation on his shoulders. Illness crept upon him in waves. His health had never been robust, and the strain of endless councils, correspondence, and decision-making worsened his condition. Gout plagued his joints, fevers left him weakened. Yet he pressed on, convinced that Providence demanded his service until the very end. Those around him remarked on his tenacity, the way he carried himself with dignity, even as his body faltered. Still, behind the walls of Whitehall, the Protector's household became increasingly quiet, marked by the anxious watch of physicians and family. The burden of rule was not only physical but emotional. Cromwell had always believed himself an instrument of God's will, chosen to guide England through trial. Yet he saw how fragile the Republic remained. Parliament and army remained uneasy partners. Conspiracies still whispered in taverns, and abroad the exiled Stuarts lingered, waiting for opportunity. The victories of the past, Dunbar, Worcester, Jamaica, seemed secure, but the future was less certain. Could the Commonwealth endure beyond the man who had held it together? In 1658, personal tragedy deepened the weight upon him. His beloved daughter, Elizabeth Claypole, fell gravely ill and died. Cromwell, usually so composed, was struck with grief. Witnesses recalled how the death pierced his heart more deeply than any battlefield wound. The sorrow seemed to accelerate his decline, draining him of the strength he had marshaled for so long. To his followers, it was as if the Lord Protector, who had stood unshaken against kings and armies, was undone by the simple anguish of a father. By late summer of that year, his condition worsened. Rumors spread through London that the Protector was failing. Prayers were offered in pulpits. Enemies waited in silence. On September 3rd, 1658, the anniversary of his great victories at Dunbar and Worcester, Cromwell died at Whitehall. To his supporters, the date itself seemed providential, as though his life had closed its circle on the day of triumph. To his critics, it was simply the end of a reign that had dominated the nation. Yet death did not diminish the aura that surrounded him. Cromwell's funeral was staged with grandeur unprecedented for a republic. Though he had refused a crown in life, in death he was mourned with the ceremony of a monarch. His body was borne in solemn procession through the streets of London, draped in black, accompanied by soldiers, officials, and the symbols of state. The city watched as drums beat a slow march and banners fluttered in the autumn air. It was a spectacle intended to cement the Protector's legacy. Not a king, but honored as one. The pomp of the funeral reflected the paradox of his rule. Cromwell had rejected royal titles, yet his reign carried the gravity of monarchy. He had sought to found a godly republic, yet his burial resembled the interment of a sovereign. To many this was fitting. Oliver Cromwell had been more than any single title could contain. He was soldier, statesman, prophet, and ruler, each role interwoven in the fabric of his life. In the weeks following his death, England held its breath. The Protectorate had been bound so closely to his person that his passing left a vacuum no ceremony could disguise. His son Richard was named successor, but all knew he lacked his father's authority and resolve. The grandeur of the funeral could not conceal the fragility of the Republic's future. Still, in that moment of mourning, England looked back at the man who had shaped its destiny. Cromwell had begun as an obscure figure in the Commons, risen through the fire of civil war, and reshaped the state with his own vision. His death marked not just the end of a life, but the close of an era, the era of revolution, of experiment, of a republic born and sustained by one extraordinary figure. Thus Oliver Cromwell passed from the stage of history, carried to his grave with the honors of a king he never was, leaving behind a nation uncertain, divided, yet indelibly changed. He had rejected a crown, but in life and in death, he bore a power and majesty that no crown could bestow. Cromwell's death closed an era, but it did not close the question of governance. The grandeur of his funeral masked the fragility of the state he left behind. For while Oliver had bound the Commonwealth to his will, he had not forged institutions strong enough to stand without him. Into this void stepped his son Richard, a man, untested by war and unknown to power. The mantle of Lord Protector passed smoothly in form, but in substance it revealed just how much the Republic had depended on the father, and how unprepared the son was to bear his weight. When Oliver Cromwell passed from the stage of history, the question that haunted England was not simply how he would be remembered, but who could possibly replace him. The Protectorate had been bound so tightly to his person that his death, in September 1658, left a vacuum that ceremony could not conceal. Into that space stepped his eldest surviving son, Richard Cromwell. By the terms of the Protectorate, the succession was smooth. Richard was proclaimed Lord Protector without serious opposition, yet the ease of transition was an illusion. The son lacked the strength, the vision, and above all, the authority that had defined the father. Richard had never been groomed for such a destiny. Unlike Oliver, who had forged his leadership on the battlefield and in the furnace of revolution, Richard had lived a quieter life, far from the roar of cannon and the fury of Parliament. He had no military background, no victories to his name, and no hardened soldiers who would follow him out of loyalty or awe. He was, by temperament, mild and courteous, a man of gentleness rather than command. Such qualities might have served well in times of peace, but in the restless climate of 1659, they appeared as weakness. At first, there was a hope that Richard might carry forward his father's legacy. The nation, weary of endless conflict, longed for stability. Some saw in him a chance for moderation, a protector less driven by zeal and more open to compromise. For a brief season, he presided over councils, received ambassadors, and sat in Whitehall as though the mantle of authority had passed naturally from father to son. Yet beneath the surface, cracks widened with alarming speed. The army, cornerstone of the Commonwealth, regarded him with suspicion. Soldiers who had marched under Oliver's banners now looked upon Richard as an outsider, untested and unfamiliar. They questioned whether he had the resolve to maintain discipline or the insight to lead. Parliament, too, hesitated. The return of civilian rule had always been in tension with the dominance of the military, and Richard lacked the stature to balance the two. Each faction saw in him an opportunity to press its own advantage, and he, unable to command or to resist, became a figure adrift. The Second Protectorate Parliament met in January 1659. Instead of rallying around the new protector, it became a stage for renewed quarrels. Republicans sought to curtail the powers of the Protectorate, Royalists plotted quietly for the return of the Stuarts, and the army pressed for greater influence. Richard, caught in the crossfire, attempted conciliation, but won the confidence of none. His speeches lacked force, his decisions lacked clarity, and every day revealed more starkly that he was no Oliver. Cromwell. By spring, the tension reached breaking point. The army, restless and distrustful, demanded back pay and a stronger voice in government. Officers muttered that Richard was unfit to lead. Parliament, meanwhile, resisted military interference, unwilling to surrender its authority to the sword. The Protectorate teetered between collapse and coup. Richard, caught between the two powers that had sustained his father's regime, could not hold them together. In May 1659, under pressure from the generals, Richard dissolved Parliament. But without parliamentary support, his authority withered. Without the army's loyalty, he had no means to enforce his will. Isolated, uncertain, and lacking the charisma that had carried his father through countless storms, Richard resigned the office of Lord Protector. In less than a year, the Cromwellian succession had unraveled. The Commonwealth unraveled as quickly as it was stitched together. The words echoed the sense of inevitability that hung over Richard's fall. What Oliver had built through faith, war, and sheer willpower could not be sustained by a successor without his gifts. The protectorate, once so imposing, now appeared as a fragile edifice, dependent not on institutions or constitutions, but on the strength of a single man. After his resignation, Richard faded into obscurity. Unlike his father, he was not remembered with awe or hatred, but with a kind of indifference. Exiled for a time, he lived quietly abroad before eventually returning to England, spending his final decades in retirement, far removed from politics. He came to be known as Tumbledown Dick, a nickname that captured the swift collapse of his brief rule. In the months that followed, England once more slipped into chaos. With Richard gone, no strong hand guided the Commonwealth. The army and parliament quarreled openly, factions multiplied, and the dream of a stable republic dissolved. In the vacuum, voices calling for the restoration of the monarchy grew louder. The Stuart cause, once thought extinguished, flickered back to life. Thus, Richard Cromwell's brief protectorate stands in history as a fragile interlude, a reminder of how much the Commonwealth had depended on Oliver's singular authority. Without the father, the son could not carry the burden. The protectorate, like its weak successor, was destined to collapse. England was once again poised on the edge of transformation, its republican experiment crumbling, its future uncertain, and the crown, long cast aside, preparing to return. Richard Cromwell's fall left more than a vacant chair in Whitehall. It left a nation adrift. The fragile republic, once held together by his father's will and vision, now splintered into quarrels between soldiers, parliamentarians, and factions, each claiming the mantle of liberty. What had begun as the promise of a new order seemed, by 1659, little more than confusion. In this climate of uncertainty, when no voice commanded trust and no institution carried weight, England turned its anxious gaze toward men of action, and from the north, one such figure began to march, a soldier who would decide the fate of the nation. The fall of Richard Cromwell left England adrift, a ship without a captain upon stormy seas. The protectorate, so firmly tied to the will and charisma of Oliver Cromwell, had dissolved into squabbling factions. Parliament called itself back into existence. The army muttered about its supremacy. Republicans and radicals argued over visions of liberty that few could agree upon. In taverns and marketplaces, the common people spoke openly of confusion and fatigue. They had lived through revolution, war, and experiment. But what had it all yielded? The republic that promised liberty now looked like chaos. Amid this turmoil, one figure rose to prominence. Not with fiery speeches or radical pamphlets, but with steady calculation. George Monk, a general hardened by campaigns in Scotland and loyal to the cause of order, emerged as the decisive actor. Neither a zealous Republican nor an ardent royalist, Monk was above all a soldier, pragmatic and disciplined. He watched as England unraveled in the months after Richard's resignation, and he understood what others dared only whisper. Without unity, the Commonwealth could not survive. In early 1660, Monk marched his army south from Scotland. His troops, seasoned and disciplined, gave him a weight no faction in London could ignore. Parliamentarians hoped he would preserve the Republic. Royalists hoped he carried secret sympathies for their cause. Monk himself kept his counsel, moving deliberately, neither committing nor revealing his full design. When he entered London, he restored Parliament, but soon forced it to dissolve itself, paving the way for a new convention parliament to be freely elected. In that assembly, the tide of opinion became unmistakable. After years of strife, England longed for a return to monarchy. Charles Stuart, exiled in the Netherlands, was invited home. The Declaration of Breda, issued in April 1660, promised amnesty for past conflicts, liberty of conscience within bounds, and the protection of property. It was a clever document, crafted to soothe fears and win broad support. Monk, seeing the inevitability of the moment, threw his weight behind the restoration. In May, Parliament formally proclaimed Charles II as king, and the monarchy, once cast down upon a scaffold, was restored. The return of Charles was greeted with scenes of jubilation. London erupted in celebration as bonfires burned, bells rang, and crowds cheered. After a decade of Republican experiment, the English people embraced the familiarity of crown and scepter. To many, it was as though the years of revolution had been an interlude, a turbulent chapter now closing with the restoration of ancient order. Yet the monarchy that returned was not the same as the one that had fallen. The civil wars and the Commonwealth had left scars too deep to ignore. Charles II was restored by Parliament's will, not by divine right alone. He had learned in exile the value of compromise, and his reign would be marked by a careful balancing act between crown and parliament. The ideals stirred by the revolution, liberty of conscience, the limits of power, the assertion of parliamentary voice, could not be erased, even as the crown was placed again upon a Stuart head. For the Commonwealth, the end came quietly. There was no final battle, no grand collapse, only a slow dissolution into uncertainty until monarchy seemed the only anchor. The soldiers who once followed Cromwell's banner now swore allegiance to the king. The institutions of the Protectorate faded. What Oliver had built by sheer will was gone within 2 years of his death, undone by weakness, division, and the yearning of a nation for stability. Thus, in 1660, the great experiment closed. England returned to kingship, but it did not return unchanged. The memory of the Commonwealth lingered in sermons, in pamphlets, in the silent ruins of ideals tested and found wanting. To some, it was a tragedy, the betrayal of liberty by a weary people. To others, it was a relief, the restoration of order after years of upheaval. To history, it stood as a moment when the English had dared to live without a king, only to find the burden heavier than they could bear. The Restoration did not erase Oliver Cromwell, nor the revolution that had borne him to power. It cast them in shadow, yet also ensured their place in the long arc of England's story. For though the crown returned, the questions raised by the Commonwealth about liberty, authority, and the balance of power would echo long after the banners of Charles II waved over Whitehall. The Commonwealth had ended, the monarchy restored, but England would never be quite the same. The storm of revolution had left behind new currents that would shape the future, ensuring that even a king must reign with caution in a nation that had once dared to cut the chain of tradition. The banners of Charles II once more flew above Whitehall, and England outwardly seemed to have returned to its old order. Yet beneath the celebrations, the memory of revolution could not be so easily buried. The decade of Commonwealth and Protectorate had left questions too deep for bonfires and bells to erase. If monarchy was restored, what then of the man who had cast it down? Oliver Cromwell, absent in body but present in memory, remained a figure both contested and unavoidable. His rule had ended, but the debate over his meaning had only just begun. The Restoration did not erase Cromwell's shadow. Instead, it sharpened the questions that would haunt his memory. Was Oliver Cromwell a military tyrant who silenced parliaments and ruled by the sword, or was he, in some paradoxical sense, a father of parliamentary democracy? His rule, and the Commonwealth he embodied, was both a cautionary tale and a milestone, a reminder of the fragility of liberty and the stubborn resilience of England's political experiment. On one hand, his protectorate bore all the marks of personal rule. He dissolved assemblies when they displeased him, governed through the support of the army, and accepted a constitution that gave him authority little short of kingship. His detractors painted him as a hypocrite, a man who condemned tyranny only to seize its mantle. The image of soldiers clearing the chamber at Westminster, while Cromwell thundered that Parliament had sat too long for any good, became an enduring emblem of military dominance over civil authority. To many, he seemed not the liberator of England, but its latest autocrat. Yet on the other hand, Cromwell's career cannot be dismissed as mere ambition. The very act of abolishing the monarchy and the House of Lords, of declaring England a free commonwealth, set a precedent that could never entirely be undone. Even though the Republic collapsed, the principle that government might rest on the consent of the governed rather than divine right had been planted in English soil. Cromwell himself believed passionately in liberty of conscience, insisting that no man should be forced in matters of faith. His parliaments, however short-lived, grappled with reforms of law, taxation, and representation. Though imperfect, they hinted at a broader vision, that the people's voice expressed through Parliament mattered more than the whims of a crown. The Commonwealth, in the end, was an unfinished experiment. It faltered on the contradictions between army and Parliament, liberty and authority, principle and pragmatism. It lasted scarcely a decade, and its institutions did not survive its founder, but the memory of those years endured. Later generations would look back at the 1640s and 1650s not only as years of bloodshed and upheaval, but as the first bold attempt to imagine England without a king. Cromwell's political legacy thus stands as a riddle. He rejected a crown, yet ruled like a monarch. He exalted Parliament, yet dismissed it when it defied him. He promised liberty, yet enforced order with the weight of the army. But through these contradictions, he forced England to confront the question of how it should be governed and who should hold power. In doing so, he became both the symbol of Republican failure and the harbinger of constitutional change. The Commonwealth unraveled as quickly as it was stitched together, contemporaries sighed. Yet its threads were not entirely lost. The debates of Cromwell's age, over representation, over the balance of power, over the rights of conscience, would echo through the glorious revolution of 1688, through the rise of parliamentary sovereignty, and eventually through the birth of modern democracy. In that sense, Oliver Cromwell remains both tyrant and trailblazer, his legacy suspended between warning and inspiration, his shadow cast across centuries of English politics. Yet Cromwell's legacy was not confined to parliaments, constitutions, or questions of sovereignty. Beyond the chambers of Westminster and the clash of armies, his vision reached deeper, into the pulpit, the household, and the fabric of everyday life. For if politics revealed his paradox, religion and society revealed his soul. It was here, in questions of faith and moral order, that the mark of Oliver Cromwell cut most sharply into England's memory. Religion and society formed the deepest undercurrents of Cromwell's legacy. He had risen in the tide of Puritan fervor, believing himself chosen to guide the nation toward godliness. That conviction shaped every corner of his rule, leaving a mark not only on laws and institutions, but on the very culture of England. The question that later generations would ask was whether this mark represented progress toward liberty or the shadow of repression. Cromwell's religious legacy was full of paradox. On one side, he defended liberty of conscience in ways that startled contemporaries. He allowed Protestants of diverse sects, Baptists, Independents, even the controversial Quakers, a place under the Commonwealth's protection. He permitted Jews absent from England for centuries to return, opening the door to communities that would contribute richly to the nation's life. To his supporters, these gestures made him a pioneer of religious toleration, one who saw faith as a matter of the soul rather than the magistrate's decree. Yet his tolerance had sharp boundaries. Toward Catholics, Cromwell was unyielding. He viewed Rome not as a spiritual alternative, but as a political threat tied to foreign powers and hostile to the Commonwealth. In Ireland, that conviction hardened into policies of exclusion, land confiscation, and surveillance that left scars for generations. Even in England, Catholic families lived under suspicion and penalty. Thus, Cromwell's religious vision was never universal liberty, but liberty for those he believed aligned with divine truth. In social life, too, his rule was remembered in contrasts. The Protectorate sought to impose moral order through Puritan discipline. Theaters were shuttered, festivals curtailed, taverns monitored, and Sunday enforced as a day of strict observance. For some, this promised a renewal of virtue, a society freed from vanity and vice. For others, it felt like a joyless regime, a world where music, drama, and merriment were sacrificed to austere ideals. The image of England under Cromwell became one of sobriety and silence, where laughter was shadowed by law. Yet even here, the story is more complicated. Cromwell himself in private was less rigid than some of his followers. He loved music, valued family, and showed warmth in his personal dealings. The severity of the Protectorate's laws often reflected the zeal of local magistrates more than the will of the Protector. Still, the association endured. Cromwell's England was an England of moral rigor, a society reshaped by Puritan conscience. Beyond laws and prohibitions, His rule also awakened enduring debates about the relationship between religion and state. Could a nation thrive on the principle of liberty of conscience? Should government enforce morality or simply protect order? These questions, sharpened by Cromwell's policies, continued to shape English society long after the Protectorate fell. The Restoration may have reopened theaters and loosened restrictions, but the memory of Puritan rigor lingered, a reminder of the thin line between reform and repression. Thus, Cromwell's religious and social legacy stands, like his political one, in tension. He was both the patron of toleration and the agent of persecution, the champion of conscience, and the enforcer of austerity. He dreamed of a godly nation, but left behind a divided memory. To some, he pointed toward a future of pluralism, where faith could not be coerced. To others, he symbolized the dangers of mixing zeal with power. What endures is the sense that Cromwell forced England to wrestle with these questions. His Commonwealth, though short-lived, had confronted the issue of how faith and freedom could coexist, how society could be reformed without stifling its soul. These questions would outlive him, shaping not only the Restoration, but the centuries to come. Yet Cromwell's influence did not end with laws, sermons, or social codes. When his life closed, the questions he had raised refused to be buried with him. Indeed, it was in memory, how he was judged, reviled, or revered, that his legacy took on its most enduring form. For long after the Protectorate crumbled, England would continue to wrestle not only with what Cromwell had done, but with what he had meant. Memory proved to be Oliver Cromwell's most enduring battlefield. His death and the swift collapse of the Protectorate did not end his influence. Rather, it launched a centuries-long struggle over how he should be remembered. Few figures in English history have provoked such divided judgment. To some, he was the savior of the nation, the man who defended liberty and conscience against tyranny. To others, he was a usurper, a king in all but name, whose iron hand crushed freedom. The legacy of Cromwell lived not only in laws and institutions, but in the imagination of the generations that followed. At the Restoration in 1660, the monarchy sought to erase him. His body was exhumed, his image vilified, his very name treated as treasonous. Royalists painted him as a monster of ambition, the man who had murdered a king and trampled England's ancient constitution. For decades, to speak of Cromwell in favorable terms was dangerous, for the restored Stuarts needed to brand the Republic as an aberration, a rebellion against divine order. His memory became a symbol of all that the monarchy wished to suppress. Yet suppression could not silence fascination among dissenters and radicals. Cromwell remained a figure of inspiration, proof that power could be wrested from kings and placed in the hands of a common man of faith. Pamphlets, sermons, and whispered stories celebrated his victories, his discipline, and his vision of a godly nation. To these communities, often persecuted themselves, he became a martyr of conscience, a reminder that England had once dared to imagine another path. As time passed, interpretations shifted. In the 18th century, Whig historians began to see Cromwell not merely as a dictator, but as part of the long march toward constitutional liberty. They argued that even his failures had helped to prepare the ground for parliamentary sovereignty, later secured in the Glorious Revolution. To them, Cromwell's Protectorate was not a final destination, but a step in the story of progress, a flawed yet necessary experiment. The Romantics of the 19th century saw him differently again. Poets and painters portrayed Cromwell as a tragic hero, a man of destiny wrestling with forces larger than himself. Carlyle, in particular, praised him as a giant of sincerity, a leader whose faith in God lifted him above the mediocrity of politics. In contrast, others condemned him afresh, portraying him as the stern oppressor of art and joy, the destroyer of Ireland, the embodiment of Puritan gloom. In modern times, the debate has never truly ended. Historians weigh him as both tyrant and pioneer, a ruler whose actions cannot be judged by simple categories. Was he the father of religious liberty or the persecutor of Catholics? Was he a defender of Parliament or its destroyer? Was he the embodiment of military dictatorship or the forerunner of constitutional government? Each generation has found in Cromwell a mirror for its own concerns, reshaping his memory to fit the questions of the present. What is certain is that Cromwell became larger than life. His image, stern, plain, resolute, became iconic. His speeches and letters, still studied, reveal a man of conviction and contradiction, torn between humility before God and confidence in his mission. His name, once cursed, later entered the pantheon of English history as one of its most complex figures. In the end, Cromwell's legacy in memory is as contested as his rule in life. He remains a riddle, hero or villain, prophet or opportunist, liberator or tyrant. Perhaps the truth lies in the tension itself, for in the clash of interpretations, one fact stands clear: Oliver Cromwell changed England forever. The Commonwealth may have ended, the monarchy may have returned, but the memory of the man who dared to shatter tradition endures, an indelible mark upon the nation's story. Yet memory alone could not contain him. The debates over Cromwell's legacy, whether tyrant or liberator, villain or hero, inevitably pointed to a larger truth. His life had become inseparable from England's own struggle with identity. To speak of Cromwell was to speak of the nation itself, its conflicts, its experiments, and its restless search for balance. And so, in the great arc of England's story, he emerges not just as a man of his age, but as a figure who defies resolution. In the great arc of England's story, Oliver Cromwell remains a figure who defies resolution. His life was the embodiment of a nation in turmoil, parliament against king, conscience against conformity, liberty against order. He rose from obscurity, carried by faith and fire, to command armies, to topple monarchy, to imagine a republic. He ruled with power as absolute as any sovereign, yet wrapped it in the language of service and providence. He rejected a crown, but embraced authority greater than many kings had ever known. The Commonwealth he built was fragile, stitched together by will more than institution, and it unraveled swiftly. After his death, the monarchy returned as though the storm had passed and tradition had reasserted itself. Yet something fundamental had changed. England had glimpsed a different path, and the questions raised in those years would not fade. What is the rightful balance between ruler and people? What liberties belong to conscience? Can a nation thrive without a crown? These questions, born in Cromwell's time, continued to echo through revolutions, reforms, and centuries of debate. His memory, like his life, divided the nation. To some, he was the tyrant who silenced Parliament and scourged joy from England's life. To others, he was the liberator who defied kings and defended conscience. History has never agreed, and perhaps never will. Yet in that very division lies his true legacy. Cromwell became a mirror of England's struggle with itself. As the centuries rolled on, his figure loomed across literature, art, and politics, sometimes villain, sometimes hero, always unforgettable. The man once denied a crown was crowned instead with memory, his shadow stretching from Whitehall to Westminster, from battlefields to pulpits. In the end, Cromwell's story is not only about the man, but about the nation that made him possible. It is about England's restless search for order and freedom, for faith and for power. The Commonwealth may have been brief, but it showed that tradition could be broken, that monarchy was not eternal, and that the people, however divided, could dream of another world. And so the curtain falls on Oliver Cromwell and the Commonwealth, a chapter of revolution and paradox, of ambition and conviction, of triumph and failure. England moved on, yet never wholly forgot, for in Cromwell the nation saw both the danger and the promise of change, the peril of power and the possibility of liberty. His was an unfinished story, one that would echo through the halls of Parliament, through the conscience of generations, through the very idea of what England might become.